more than ever in the history of left forward. So this discussion topic came up as how we talk about the organizing tradition across generations, and not have it a condescending kind of discussion about it. Because Lord knows that the older generations have made their share of mistakes. So but to have it a two-way conversation so that younger people could ask questions about the kind of organizing they wanted to know about instead of being preached to. And as background to that discussion, I thought about the way we learn about it in school and in the old days and how we're teaching it now. The hard thing about talking about organizing tradition is that in earlier scholarship, it was a non-discussion because poor people were not supposed to be able to organize themselves, and people generally were not supposed to be able to organize themselves. Richard Hofstadter was a major American historian in the earlier period, and who actually started out as a communist, and he wrote this book called The American Political Tradition. By the time he wrote The Age of Reform, he concludes that the populist movement and other mass movements like that were almost inherently proto-fascist, right? And so, on the one hand, we were being taught to fear mass movements because they would probably become fascist. It's part of the American thing. And on the other hand, you had my old buddy Michael Harrington, who's no longer with us now, wrote The Other America, and his camp was convinced that poor people just couldn't organize themselves. It was quite preposterous. Matter of fact, I think he thought poor people's movement was an oxymoron. So between those two legacies, people like Fran Fox Piven and Richard Carr wrote the book Poor People's Movement to kind of push back on that and to discuss the potential of people organizing themselves. Now, Fran Piven, they emphasize and talk about poor people's movements, the power of disruption, right? And basically, that was their claim, that basically poor people definitely had the power to disrupt things, but Fran in particular, in those days anyway, I'm sure she believes that now, thought that it was a fool's errand to think you could have ongoing organizing, that had been, as far as she was concerned, she looked at the different projects, and that's where these movements had failed when they tried to organize enduring organizing over time. So she thought quick disruption was the power that poor people had. And if they tried to do more than that, they were going to be, it was a fool's errand. Charles Payne came along. He looked at the Mississippi movement. And I just happened to meet with Charles Payne when he was writing that book, because I was at Northwestern, he was a professor at Northwestern, and they shanghaied me to go down to Mississippi. You know, the weird thing is Sarah Lawrence has a connection with the Mississippi movement. When I went down to Jackson, Mississippi, and they introduced me as a professor from Sarah Lawrence, everybody didn't know about Sarah Lawrence. Turns out that Sarah Lawrence was an R&R place for the SNCC workers and the Mississippi people, and many the Wentworths used to put people up during the 60s. And many of the children from SNCC ended up going to Sarah Lawrence because of that. So that was a strange connection. But anyway, but Charles Payne was writing a book called I've Got the Light of Freedom about the organizing tradition in the Mississippi movement. And he basically argued against Piven that poor people could organize themselves not just for disruption, but they could organize themselves around self-emancipation. And that there was an organizing tradition, very much a feminist organizing tradition that passed through people like Septima Clark in South Carolina with the Citizenship Schools, with Ella Baker, of course, who helped set up SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then through Bob Moses and people like that onto the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and on and on. So that's kind of where we've been with that discussion. And so then the question has been to look at these organizations and see what kind of organizing tradition they have. My work, since much of that, the way Charles Payne framed it, the organizing tradition was very much Southern. It's a Southern Christian tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And I was trying to make sense out of the civil rights movements I saw in the North, whether it be Brooklyn or Harlem or Boston and places like that. And so I've been working on organizing tradition in Jim Crow North. You had your hand up, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask what the Mississippi movement was, but I figured it out.
Oh, it's all those different civil rights movements in Mississippi. It's a pretty big thing that ended up culminating in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, led by Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, and that crew of women.
It was like 1964, 68.
Yeah. It culminates, the big dramatic thing is 64, but it goes on. We'll talk more about it after a while. But so basically that's, so what I found out, now my colleague Jean Harris, we've edited 3 books together. She's writing a biography of Rosa Parks. And in studying that material, I became more and more aware of the, she found the fact that just before Rosa Parks, before she did the Montgomery bus boycott, was basically an anti-rape organizer in the 1940s. We've been doing some scholars have been talking about the different civil rights traditions. One is armed self-defense or self-defense. There's a book called Pure Fire by Christopher Strain, I believe it is, that argued that self-defense is a masculine thing, and that women, he didn't find any women in any self-defense groups. I found that hard to believe, but that's what he said, right? I didn't know where he put Harriet Tubman and women like that, but I.B. Wells. But it occurred to me that we had been defining self-defense in very masculine terms, and that we left out on the anti-rape organizing. If you think about white terror in terms of what that meant for women, it was oftentimes gang rape. And there's a long tradition of organizing against that kind of terror. Now, Rosa Parks, though, started organizing against gang rapes as a leader of the NAACP in the 1940s. A woman was gang raped by about 4 guys, and she went out to organize that committee. This is in the 1940s, and she basically, some people argue that that was the seed of the Mississippi Montgomery bus boycott movement that flowered 10 years later. But in Jean,
book too. There's a relatively new book about her and about that. Dark at the end of the.
There you go. And that Jean doesn't make that same argument. This new book is going to be, February. Next February is the 100th birthday of Rosa Parks. So we're going to have the book will be out by then, and we'll have a big thing at the Schomburg, and I think Julian Bond will be there, and it's going to be a big thing for the centennial of Rosa Parks. But it turns out that on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell from Harlem visited Montgomery and talked to them about the Harlem bus boycott of 1941. So that was the smoking gun I've been looking for in terms of organizing tradition in the Jim Crow North. Because it's very clear that many of the bus boycotts started in places like Harlem decades before the Montgomery bus boycott. And we've kind of written that out of history and said that people in the North are too northern or not Christian enough or too secular or too urbanized to organize themselves, which doesn't make too much sense. So now we talk about the different, the organizing tradition in the Midwest, the one in the West, Jim Crow West. Just, each area had its own tradition of how people organize themselves. Thank goodness, because America is a very big country, and it's a different terrain you're organized on. So people have worked out a way to organize themselves based on the terrain you're on. And just because it doesn't look like Mississippi doesn't mean it's not an organizing tradition for self-emancipation. Now, the hub of the question for American history was the populist movement, so we keep coming back to the populist movement over and over again. And Omar Ali has written a book called, it's an expensive book, so I can't use it in my classes, it's only this hardback. It's called In the Lion's Mouth, Black Populism in the New South from 1886 to 1900. And he documents the black populist organizations in here. It's always been said that the black populist movement probably was the largest mass movement of black people in American history. I'm not really sure about that because it seemed to me emancipation was probably the largest movement that people did. That's at least 4 million people there. But the black populist thing, they clock it at around 1 million members. And what they would do, they called their organization and I always found that a fascinating name. Why did they call it the wheel? That was a symbol that they're moving forward the wheel of history kind of thing, right? And they actually had this visionary thing that they could take history, and they had cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, and artisan cooperatives, and things like that. So he details each state and each county almost in here to show you how different they were and how they organized themselves, and then they would meet at the state level and form a state wheel, and on and on and on. Of course, they were crushed by the Klan and other terrorist groups as times went on.
This was in the Jim Crow South during the 1880s.
Yeah, he's talking about until 1900.
How were they not totally crushed by the Klan and by the authorities? They must have been really secretive and underground. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, they were open and secret. There was a combination of things. They would have public parade. That's why we know they existed. They had, because there's records of them. Yeah, so there's a long tradition of even back during slavery. Let's talk about with emancipation. The Union Leagues, I would say, is one of your first political movements of African Americans in the South. As soon as slavery is over, within the Republican Party, African Americans joined the Union Leagues by the thousands in places like Mississippi and Alabama, which was the heart.
Protection of Reconstruction, right?
Pardon me?
That was under the protection of Reconstruction.
In theory, they had the space of Reconstruction. They had the space of, but they had to protect themselves.
Oh,
and as a matter of fact,
I didn't know it was the metaphor. Sorry.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's the women with the armed self-defense in the Union Leagues. We know that the women basically stood guard with the rifles while they had political meetings and things like that. So that's why I found the Pure Fire book that said women didn't participate in self-defense a little ridiculous. As a matter of fact, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a nonviolent person, in 1964 at the Atlantic City Democratic Convention, when she thought that one particularly was going to betray them, she explained to him that she might slit his throat. I'm sure it was nonviolently. But I think sometimes we stereotype these movements, right? I mean, people have the full range of emotions and capacities like everybody else.
I mean, just because they're trying to make movement doesn't mean they're not sexist.
Oh, yeah.
Layers.
Yeah.
And maybe the difference is they weren't thinking of it as self-defense but offense. You know, I'm not going to take care of myself if I'm attacked, but I'm going to, you know, almost take the forward step.
Well, one thing that in this book, Jean has a whole chapter on Rosa Parks and Black Power. And she talks about the way we misunderstand Rosa Parks is to cut her life off and say her life ends, basically, she's on, pause from the time the Montgomery Bus Boycott is over to the fact that she's 90-something. And, she moved to Detroit because she couldn't make a living in Alabama anymore. Her husband lost his job at the Air Force Base as soon as the boycott started. She lost her job, of course. They never received any money from the civil rights movement, even though much money was being raised. She lived in the public housing projects in Montgomery, by the way. So they were extremely poor. And when they moved to Detroit, they were still poor. They didn't have many opportunities. And then finally, they got a job, and she helped elect Congressman Conyers in Detroit. And he hired her as the administrative secretary. From that point on, she basically nurtured many of the Black Power generation. And she's known at all the Black Power churches, the House of the Black Madonna, at the Black Power bookstore. She was always in the front row. And so they document that. And she says that basically she didn't agree. She admired King's nonviolence, but she said she couldn't do that, what King was doing. And actually, she said she agreed more with Malcolm X in terms of self-defense. Rosa Parks' grandfather was a Garveyite in Alabama. He got discriminated against because he was too light-skinned. Otherwise, they would have been full-fledged Garveyites. So he thought he was a white man. And she grew up in a kind of a Garvey household. And so she always was a race woman and the whole 9 yards. And so what's called Malcolm's last message is a speech he made in February 1965 before he assassinated Detroit. That was a meeting to honor Rosa Parks. That's the third time she met Malcolm X, was at that meeting. She had signed her program. In the front cover of my last book, I Want to Start a Revolution, is a picture of Rosa Parks with a Malcolm X poster that says, by any means necessary, and she's giving him a big smile. So this is kind of the undiscovered Rosa Parks and things like that. She thought that, self-defense should be a common sense. She said, I always believed in protecting myself as much as I could. She didn't believe in self-destruction or something like that, but she didn't. And I think being a woman in the South fighting the form of terrorism that black women fought, surrender would mean something quite different for a woman. I think we think about violence and nonviolence in very masculine terms, and I think we're trying to rethink history now by looking at the majority of the members of these movements are women. So what did it look like for them? And they're giving us a much more complicated story of civil rights and what civil rights meant for them. And it definitely includes, she defined self-defense as self-protection.
Not to in any way belittle her actions, I'm wondering in either way, would the retaliation against a woman who was protecting herself from using violence be different for a man?
Some people think so.
I don't have an opinion on this.
Charles Payne, in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, which I love this book, but I think he's silly when he said, we know that women participated more in the Mississippi movement than men did. So when we talk about local people, we're talking about 75% women. And their argument is that women would face less repercussions for being active. I don't believe that. If you look at who are the women in Little Rock, Daisy Bates. Daisy Bates was the NAACP leader in Little Rock. Now, Daisy Bates was an orphan because her mother was gang raped, and when her father tried to intercede, they murdered him and her mother. So she grew up an orphan. When she became active in the NAACP, she had to have that in mind and had known what was at stake and what the repercussions would be. So I think in some ways we belittle women to say what we're saying. Actually, it was more dangerous to be a woman. Fannie Lou Hamer is a case in point. That Fannie Lou Hamer story of Mississippi is what woke me up when I was a kid, because to read about her being tortured in the prison cell for being trying to register people to vote We know now she was sexually abused when they had her down in that jail cell. When forget his name now. Giat. When Lawrence Giat came to get them out of jail, they not only abused him, but they tried to put electric wire to his testicles. So, people in the old days, people didn't want to talk about the sexual dimension of the white terror because it messed up the decorum of talking about the movement, right? But I think when we're talking about what people would, the abuse they suffered and what the consequences were later in life, Fannie Lou Hamer really never recovered from the beating she got. That was, to the day she died, she suffered from near blindness in one eye and all kinds of physical ailments to the day she died. So, and I think you take a lot away from the courage of these women by saying simple things like it would be less for a woman. That's not, but you hear that a lot. But the stories I hear, when you get down to what the stories are, women were organizing it. Gang rape was it seemed as if almost a routine thing that was going on against black women, and there was no legal protection. And what they're struggling for, civil rights for women in that situation means that the law would be enforced when it comes to a black woman being raped. And when Rosa Parks went down to that shack to investigate that case, the police circled the house and then finally broke into the house to threaten her for investigating that case. So these women were very much aware of how dangerous this work they were doing was, and give them that due that they had the courage to do that work. I mean, that's what that is, right? And I know, hearing the Fannie Lou Hamer, I had been beaten by the police when I was 12 years old. And I think that story, out of all the stories, encouraged me to join the civil rights movement because I guess she came back from that. And I was trying to figure out how do you come back from this kind of humiliation and beating. And her example really inspired me to join the movement. And I immediately said, well, that's Mississippi, how can I join? And somebody said, there's a SNCC office in Newark. But, so those stories were, I think that inspired many people. You know there's a movement building when people hear a story like that, instead of running away, join. Right? That's because you're always going to have this kind of terrorism going on. And throughout the history, that's what scares people away. But when there's a terrorist act like that and people join, that's when you know we have some momentum for a movement. Because there's a different here. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'd be shocked if women weren't persecuted and punished more harshly for being women, because of the audacity of the act of resistance or nonconformity on the part of a gender who's expected to conform, expected to be demure, etc., etc. They're stepping further out of bounds from what's expected of them. It's a much more audacious act than for a man to do the same thing. Plus the fact that they're a little more vulnerable, or at least perceived to be more vulnerable. Easier target to punish with a little bit of cruelty, retribution.
Well, gender complicates all of these things, but I think what we need to do is get the full record without these blinders on, and then sort it out once we've got all the data in. But we've been blind to this for so long. There's some male chauvinism that made it easier for women to carry weapons in the civil rights movement because they wouldn't frisk women the way they frisked men. And so I know a lot of women used to carry the guns and the switchblades into meetings and stuff like that because they would take it that they knew that the guy was stupid, so stupid that they thought that women were not armed. So I knew that was quite. Yeah, but it's at play. But in terms of them being immune from it, at some point, for historians to say that, either you're not qualified to be writing the history, or you're being very irresponsible. And I love Charles Payne. I mean, but he says that, and it just, if you listen to Fannie Lou Hamer, she didn't have any exemption. And when I interviewed, as a matter of fact, there was a 12-year-old girl with Fannie Lou Hamer that day. That was the first time she was sexually abused. As a matter of fact, if there's a book called, there's a film called, it's one of the first ones on women in the Mississippi movement. There's a beautiful one called Standing on My Sister's Shoulders, but that's not the one I'm talking about right now. I won't remember because I'm trying to remember. But there's many of the women, the young women they interviewed in the Mississippi movement documentary done by a woman around 1991. What's her name? Kat. Explained that one of the reasons they joined the movement was because they had been raped as little girls. Right? That the domestic service. I think she said it was her 8th birthday, and the master of the house told her to come upstairs to his bedroom, and he raped her. And when she joined the civil rights movement, that was a way for her to get herself back in order, right? And so it's a very different story. But I think the more you read about it, the more you see that rape, and so I said that rape was the form of white terror that many women felt. But then if you look at the lynching exhibits, which not something I think you want to do, but when I looked at the lynching exhibit that they had in New York, and there's a book by Leon Litwack that has all the lynchings, one thing that hit me was that maybe 25% of the lynchings that we have pictures of, because they took pictures and they made postcards and things like that to send home to their mothers. 25% of women and children. At least 25% of the pictures. Yeah. So then the whole thing about rape started to be, okay, what are we talking about here? Who did these women rape, right? And you start to realize the various reasons, and some of it was them being out of place and being tortured. And the weird thing about those pictures is that there's a fetish going on there, because when they took the pictures, they were dressing the corpses and posing with the pictures, send home the postcard home to their mother. So even the economic reason can't be the total reason for this going on, because why would you it's similar to Jewish anti-Semitism in Europe here. There's a ritual involved and some symbolic meaning going on there, along with the simple act of killing somebody because they're playing with the corpses. But that's the thing that struck me. You start to realize how many women were lynched. And there's some feminists who are writing about lynching now to talk about how many white and black women were lynched in the South during these periods of time. So it's a much more complicated story. Now, let me get off that negative point of view here, sorry. There's a book by Annalise Orlick called Storming Caesar's Palace, How Black Women Fought Their Own War on Poverty.
In Las Vegas, where I'm from.
There we go.
Yeah, Annalise has spoken on the book a couple times. And some of those women are still alive in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
You know that, right? They come and they talk in our classes.
Thank goodness.
I'm being a commercial, sorry, but it's totally cool. And as you said about Rosa Parks, they're poor and they're broke and they live in a pretty bad section of town. It's so sad because they had such a difference in Las Vegas in terms of that. But they live in, just like you said about Rosa Parks in Detroit.
That's Jim Crow North. Jim Crow West, I'm sorry.
Jim Crow West. Yeah,
Jim Crow West. And I think I talk about that, well, first of all, to understand what racial oppression looks like, but also to see what barriers they had to overcome to do what they're going to do. But you see here, the women did economic development projects. They developed, they built the community, they built the library, senior citizens' homes, affordable housing, things like that, right? So the more we look into it, we're finding the capacity of all these people, not just to organize themselves, but also to develop alternative economic projects, which is very relevant if we're going to talk about the Occupy Wall Street, because I think one thing that limits our conversation is our impoverished vision of what poor people have been able to do for themselves. And let's remember, the populist movement was about, they were fighting poverty. Right? They were fighting poverty through trying to found economic cooperatives and self-help groups. So there's a deep American tradition, black people and white people, right, the problem they were having, the populist movement, of course, is that how to unite the two groups. That was the big issue. And part of what kept the Klan off the populist movement, the black populists, in the golden age was that they had an alliance with the white populists for mutual defense.
Interesting.
And the end of that alliance, when some of the infamous leaders, Tom Watson, who actually stopped several lynchings in Georgia, when he becomes a rabid white supremacist, that signals the end of that, and then becomes much more dangerous to be a black populist. But I think many of the children in the civil rights movement had grandparents who were in this movement, and they passed this on.
What was the cause of the white populists back then? What were they trying to accomplish with their?
Well, with the railroad, they were being impoverished because of lack of credit, all kinds of problems with the farm, right?
We're talking about like the bull weevil problems that were happening right around then, making it difficult to farm cotton.
Yes, but well, also the cost of the railroads transporting their goods to market, right? There's a lot going on.
They were being cheated by robber barons.
Yeah, that's the rhetoric they used. The white populace in the main, there were also artisans, and in the West there were a lot of miners involved in the populist movement. So the populist movement varied from region to region, right? But the big difference between the white populace in general and the black populace was that the white populace in the main are landowners who are not able to make it. Many of the black populace were farm workers. And so there was a direct clash of economic interests. And then, of course, there was Jim Crow. So it didn't work out in the end. But there was a period when they this guy starts his book out with military parades in the South where black populists are the armed guard for white populist leaders. And he starts out with these public displays of racial unity, and then he goes into the background and just finds, I would say, endless. I mean, the book is just a stream of newspaper reports and all kinds of farmer newspapers where these reports are. So now we have to make sense out of what he found, but he's got it. And like he says, they were organizing in the lion's mouth. They understood that, right? Which shows you, despite terror, that people organize themselves, right? And this is what you could see, and you wonder how much it was invisible to you, right? One thing I would say about the women organizers generally, who ended living longer, like Rosa Parks and Vicki Garvin and a lot of women I studied, I think they were much better at secrecy than some of the men were. And I think that's a lesson we should all learn, that if you're going to live to fight another day. Rosa Parks was never that informative about her organizing and what she did. And the other person I would think about who was never that informative was Harriet Tubman, who lived to be, I think, about 100 years old or something like that, right? Turn of the century. And I think as far as Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman were concerned, the struggle was not over. And so you're not going to explain all the mysterious ways you got to, because you may have to use some of those networks.
Or other people are saying.
Right? Yeah.
You have Douglas in his first narrative where he gets to the point of making this separate produces. He critiques the Underground Railroad because he says too much is getting out of that. People are getting out, and this doesn't serve the interest of getting them out.
Yeah, matter of fact, he was too explicit, and the slave master said, "Oh, that's my property, I want you back." Loose lips sink ships. And there's the other way to talk about it, right? But I think that that's just been, I talked to some of the Black Panthers whose parents had been in the movement. And one guy from Buffalo, his father was a steel worker, and he said, "We always had guns, but we were never stupid enough to walk down the street with them." He said, "I don't know what you young people are doing," right? So we have to watch whose voice we're listening to sometimes, because sometimes we listen to a man or a younger person, and we need to hear the other voice about that's getting stereotyped, because now that people are getting older, they're starting to realize there's some wisdom in what the other people are doing, because they knew what was going to be, what the consequences would be for walking around with a gun in the street and stuff like that. So, yeah, so I think that the other thing I wanted to mention, so I brought this Richard Wright book here, is I taught a whole course on the Black Arts Renaissance this year, and there's a book called The Chicago Black Renaissance and Women's Activism. And, I thought it was going to be an art book. It's by Ann Knupfer. And it is a window into a whole world. The Chicago Black Renaissance of the 1940s into the 1950s is a massive movement. It's a mass self-education movement around Black history movement. It involves school teachers, librarians, museum people, parents and teachers, right? They're fighting housing issues and things like that. It's a massive movement. It has writers' workshops. It has publications. Richard Wright is involved in it. Margaret Walker, Gwen Brooks, on and on. Catherine Dunham, the dancers. They have community centers, right? And so what we're starting to realize now is that and there was a working class cultural movement that also took care of social justice issues at the same time. So we're starting to see that the Cold War in many ways has destroyed much of the record of this. But the more we dig into it, what we find is just these movements are crowded with women leaders. That's the big revelation. So that whenever it would seem that maybe 60 or 70% of the leaders were women, and just about all these things. I think the story out of the Southside Writers Workshop is Richard Wright, Margaret Walker was the youngest in the group, and Ted Ward, a number of those writers were trying to figure out what this Black aesthetic should be. And they were theorizing and so Margaret Walker wrote the poem, For My People, and embodied it. He said, is this what you're talking about? So that's, over and over again, you start to see the vanguard role that many of these women have played in these movements. And so I was trying to do some research on jazz clubs in Newark, and my father's in a nursing home. And so I brought a book called, written by this woman called, Stop Jazz Club, I can't remember the name right now. So I asked my dad, I said, well, Dad, did you ever dance, what kind of musicians played at this club and stuff like that? And he said, well, that's where I met your mother. So I started realizing that I was studying this history, but it was actually my history. There are 4 guys in this quarter that my dad is in, and one guy had never said anything for 2 years. At the end of the discussion, he asked me, is the Key Club in there? That's where I used to dance. It's the first time he's said anything after 4 years, right? I played Saturday Night Fish Fry. My father had me doing research for this book, okay? So he said, find the Louis Jordan's Saturday Night Fish Fry. So I brought it in and put it on my iPod and played it. The woman walking with the cane out in the hallway started dancing. So this is a totally by accident I've started to come upon, and now they're telling me their stories. And what they're telling me is how they organize themselves around dance clubs, sports clubs, that the sports arenas were segregated, so they had to build their own teams. My aunt Elizabeth died, and this is the only time with poor people when your history is written is in the obituary. So in the obituary, it said that my aunt Lizzie played in the Negro Leagues. I'd never heard of women in the Negro Leagues, so I went to my dad and I said, well, Dad, you always told me about the boys playing in the Negro Leagues, but you didn't tell me that Aunt Lizzie played in the Negro Leagues. He said, well, all of your aunts played in the Negro Leagues.
You just never asked.
So this is one of my research projects. So the more they tell me these stories, women organize themselves into sports clubs. Well, working people generally did that. Jewish working people in Newark, New Jersey organized themselves into boxing clubs to fight Nazis who were attacking in the streets of Newark. And the African American boxing clubs were allied with the Jewish boxing clubs. They later found themselves into the New Deal Democratic Party. And the New Deal Democratic Party builds a mass base by recruiting athletes who are quite popular in the community, who have traveled. Women like my Aunt Lizzie would travel from county to county and have statewide networks. So they basically showing me how they turn their sports networks, social networks, into political networks. And so it's really opened up my understanding of what it looks like and things like that and how people do it. Some of the things my aunt was trying to explain to me when I was younger, I didn't understand, but now I'm understanding a little bit better.
It sounds to me that that huge, civil rights movement that everyone learns about, that happened in the mid-'60s, took 100 years to build from the grassroots through all these sub-organizations and movements that you're describing right now, and somehow coalesced into this event.
Yeah, the scholarship, what they're calling it now, is the Long Civil Rights Movement. And I call it the Long Black Revolt. The reason I say that is because my dad didn't think he was in the Civil Rights Movement. He wanted to play baseball. He was part of boxing clubs. And I think that in the city, people are organizing for a better life, generally, that wouldn't be called civil rights. And also to redefine urban space, right? And so a lot of the spaces they had were really funky spaces, and they were excluded from a lot of the sports leagues, so they built their own. And they often tell me that, I think my uncle literally got the wood and built the club, the boxing club they had. And so the more you ask these questions and hear your story, you start to realize, okay, later, because I did urban planning and architecture later, but it's built on this urge that they had even earlier to build their own. If you're not going to give me space, they are going to define my own space. So it's a broader impulse that people have.
Well, my question actually was about the Occupy movement and things that people are upset about nowadays. Do you think that it was necessary for that 100 years to happen, and all these different movements and sub-movements with people having various motives for wanting to do this or that, to kind of come together and eventually, crescendo at this moment in the early 60s? Is that necessary? Do you need to put 100 years together, or was this something that was kind of, moving one direction and then switching direction and moving somewhere else, and then not going in a straight line, and then eventually finding its way, to...
I don't think there has been a generation in American history since the Civil War, at least, that hasn't struggled for these democratic reforms. They've been defeated, right? And then each generation built on top of that generation, but we could have had the democratic reform during the populist period. We could have had it during the New Deal. Think about it. The Black Panther Party had survival programs to feed children and things like that. The more I look into this history from my father's eyes, the more I realize that Father Divine, Daddy Grace, Sister Lucy, and all these spiritual movements, they were feeding people in the 1930s. And then many things we did in the Civil Rights Black Power movement was built on things we knew we could do because our grandparents had done it. I mean, Father Divine had real estate, he had hotels, they fed people in healthy meals, very cheap. My father said he could get a lunch for 10 cents when he was a worker and he was a kid and stuff. Like everybody knew to go to Father Divine to get. The story of Father Divine is kind of an interesting beginning. Originally, Father Divine had an interracial congregation in Long Island in the 1930s. And his white neighbors complained because they said they were praying too loud and his car was too big. So they called the police on him and they got him for something like interracial intermingling or something along that line. Praising God with interracial crowd. Some official thing. And so he had black and white members, and they said if you convict him, God will strike you dead, to this young judge. The judge gave him 5 years hard labor for this crime. About 5 days after this sentence, the judge dropped it. The media went to Father Divine's prison cell and asked him what did he think about it. And after he paused for a minute, he said, "Well, I'm sorry I had to do it." The next judge released him from jail. And that's when Father Divine went to Harlem for the first time and became a black leader in Harlem. And what he did with the power he had, he built economic cooperatives, real estate, he bought hotels, he fed the poor. And so many of these movements, I think sometimes we've been a little too narrow in the examples we draw on. We only want to talk about what the leftists did and not what these spiritual political mavericks did. And when you look at the larger thing, you start to see that America has been crowded for a long time with just ordinary people who organized themselves, who saw these needs, and I think we've kind of impoverished our alternatives by not looking at all the democratic forces that were out there. And, you know, we've kind of given religion a bad name. I think that's a dumb thing to do. I mean, many religious people are very progressive. They've been doing social justice work for quite a long time. And many of the things we want to tout are built based on things that they've done in the past. And that's just as much as an American tradition as it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that really hit me was how much self-education I saw in these black movements, right? And then I realized that this guy, Hubert Harrison, who was a postal worker who became an intellectual, he was in correspondence with Tolstoy. And it turns out, and he would write in his articles, if Tolstoy can educate peasants in Russia, why can't we educate poor people in Harlem? So this is part of a broader kind of a movement, and it turns out that many of them were, like Frederick Douglass and all these people, many of those speeches we're reading from Frederick Douglass are part of a lecture, traveling lecture they were doing. There were self-education colleges throughout the country in the 19th century. And many of these people later found the University of Chicago and places like that, right? So in many, we've lost part of the texture of American history where Americans were doing these things for themselves. And as these big structures begin to collapse, I think we need to look back at these traditions and see that Adam Clayton Powell had a sermon he would give to poor people who were desperate and thought they didn't have anything to say. Well, you know, just like God said to David, you know, what's in your hands? Right? What do you have? Moses, I can't do anything. Well, what's in your hands? Right? And in each case, he had given them the tools they had. Right? You already got in your hand what you need to liberate yourself. Right? And so he would use that lecture, and I think that's part of this organizing tradition, to tell people that what you have in your hands. Bob Moses in his Algebra Project taught me a lesson, a math lesson. He said, well, okay, what was the last time you had to make do? You didn't have what you needed, you had to make do with something. Now, all the teachers in our workshop had to write a make-do story. And at the end of the 40 stories, said all of you had a make-do experience. In math, they call that equivalence. That's the principle of equivalence. What organizers do is help people identify what they have in their hand to be the equivalent to what they need to make. Right? It's the equivalent, right? To reimagine the elements you have, you can use that to get where you're going. Whether it's the Mississippi Freedom Movement, an economic cooperative, that you basically, the people in your community have the talents if you organize them together to do most of the things you need. Right? And part of the organizers thing is like a talent scout to realize that America's crowded with genius, and we identify that talent and say, let's put this together and do this school, this cooperative, post-New Orleans, Katrina, post-Katrina, New Orleans, all these different things. That's basically what we do. We don't really organize people. We pull people together to organize themselves around their talents. That's the way I see it. And I think Bob Moses basically was teaching me that when I was in that, when he was taking me to Mississippi. And he teaches that to school children in math classes. They did the math in the Baltimore school system and realized that their school was underfunded. The class went and sat in the State House in Maryland and demanded more school funding for all the children in the Maryland school system. Right? So basically he had them do the math, but it's the math of your life, right? And what's social justice mean, and weigh that, make judgments, and organize yourself around that. And so I think that's the kernel of it, and I don't think that's the more we look at it, that's something shared by many Americans, whether they were Yiddish socialists in the early 20th century in New York City, or Irish. All these different groups seem to have that kind of parallel. And I think that was the basis for them getting together. And I think we've lost much of that history, unfortunately. I mean, people are writing about it now. You had your hand up.
Well, I was reading this book, I think it's called The New Jim Crow. Michelle Ellison. And if I get her premise right, okay, so you know it's the crisis in our country that one out of 3 young black men are somewhere in the justice system, right? And that, it was a disease, it would be a public health problem. Anyway, I haven't read the whole thing, but I think what she talks about is, like you said, gave the tool in their hands, like, I think this is right, that everybody always takes a plea deal, and part of what her argument is, if every single person that had to go in front of a court said, I'm not taking a plea, I have to take this to trial, it would cause the whole justice system to crash. Do you know what I mean?
I got you.
And am I right? Is that what she's saying?
Well, I can't recall that particular part, yeah, but
But that would be like a social, and who knows if it ever happened, but that would be a social change in justice, because it would grind to a halt. Because every single person takes a plea deal to get it through. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. Well, on the education front, one of the reasons I started this research is because I listened to educators say that basically cost of college education is sky high. And if you don't get a college education, you're going to go to prison. And I thought about what that meant for my community listening to that. And so I started trying to figure out what were grassroots self-education tool instruments that people had. And because you can't tell kids these are the only two alternatives, right? Because there's more choices than that. And I think that's what I've been trying to get over, is that if we look at this history, people have identified, our ancestors have identified many choices. You don't have to be going to Ivy League school or prison. There's many choices in between. There are people in Harlem and Bronx, Brooklyn, the Jewish socialists and the Harlem socialists got together on many occasions. And matter of fact, they had socialist Sunday schools in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in those early days. Stuff. There's a book called Brownsville, Brooklyn. So the more you look at the social history, you see that almost all of these things have social movements, and one of the first things they do is set up an education system. And some of them have written quite great books on their situation there. So, and these writers' workshops in Chicago, they were not school funded. Matter of fact, they existed at the public library. Matter of fact, the Schomburg Library. Let's think about it. We usually think about culture of poverty in a place like Harlem, but the Schomburg was in this guy's house first. And when it outgrew his house, then they made it a public library. Right? So I've been looking at people's artist homes as salons and saying that oftentimes we've been saying there's no cultural institution in this community. We have to look at people's homes.
Well, that's how the women's movement started, people's living room.
Right.
Right?
And I'm also trying to empower all parents
For sure.
to look at their home. You can have a little library at home. Even if this, I'm not saying we should allow the government to cut libraries. I'm not saying that. But even if the government cuts the library, don't tell your child there's no alternative but go to prison. We have tools in our own hands. Right? I think it's irresponsible for us to do those things. So my job is to go around now talking to my father and the other people who are dancing in the hallways there, and to help them understand first what their own grandparents were. And let their grandparents tell them, in this community we have these resources. That we've done much with little in the past, and don't lose hope. Right? And I think each community has those stories. So we were trying at one point to give every child a tape recorder in Mississippi to interview their grandparents, because many of these women, the Fannie Lou Hamer's generation, were getting very old and they were about to die. We didn't get the grant, unfortunately, to do that. But we thought that every public school should have people go home and interview their grandmothers before it was too late. And even if they didn't understand everything they said in the beginning, when they listened to the tape later, they'd be able to get it and understand what. Plus, I think one of the big lessons I'm trying to tell people, there's a park that I tried to build in the 70s that was just built. It's called Nat Turner Park, was built 2 years ago. And there's a sign up about the park and stuff like that.
Where is it?
It's in Newark. It's Newark has parks in every ward except for the Central Ward, because the Central Ward was Jewish. And the city council at the time, and the Jewish workers said, we're paying taxes, why don't we have a park? I said, because you're Jewish. So blacks and Latinos moved into that ward, and therefore they didn't have a park. So in my generation, we were building a park, and the city stopped us. And mainly the grandparents of many children who live in this neighborhood now that helped me plant that park. So my job is to go back and tell those kids how much their grandparents loved them. Even though your textbooks might be telling you different, that they saw you as priceless. And every time you enjoy this park, that shows you how much your grandparents loved you. And I think each community has a story like that. And I think that's part of those kids' endowment, in a sense, right? That they have a bigger endowment than they know they have, right? And so that's kind of the way I've started to think about this history. Probably because of my dad. So sometimes being in nursing home is a good thing.
I'm wondering whether you notice a pattern among all these different movements in the past 100 years or whatever, 150 years, that would explain why each of them failed to achieve everything that each of them wanted to achieve.
Well, I think that's the story of freedom, right? Throughout history, is that we start out thinking we can't do anything, and if we're lucky, we get a chance to do some things, and you're trying to see how far you can go. You're always going to hit the limit, right? I mean, my generation, they told us that we couldn't do sit-ins, that they had done sit-ins in the 40s and they hadn't worked, right? And when we did sit-ins, the thing crumbled. So then we went into voting rights, and we did that, and inevitably you come up against the real door, that's a wall, right? So I think that's what each generation is defining, what it means to be free in that time, and what are the limits. And I think in many ways, you have to hit that solid wall to find, that's how you find out that this is not possible for this generation.
The solid wall is like the deeper isms, it seems like.
What's the
Say it again.
The wall, like institutional sexism. I mean, women still earn what? 72 cents to the dollar?
Right.
And remember, I mean, when you were, well, just saying what you were talking before, I mean, black men got the vote, what, a couple decades before black women. I mean, the hierarchies are still alive and well. It's not like through the social movements they stopped.
Right, but I'm saying each movement is struggling, and some things that the older generation says are impossible, we sweep them away right away because things have changed. I mean, my son, I had to tell my son when he got ready to apply to college, I said, well, Kuza, you're going to apply to all these schools. Don't be surprised if you get rejected by a number of these schools. He was accepted in every school he applied to. He said, Dad, what are you talking about? I said, well, don't forget about it. Right? So, things had changed, right? Things had changed. So, and I think that's the story that each generation has to figure that out for themselves. And we shouldn't try to put the dead hand of history on the next generation because it's moved around, right? It's moved around.
Well, it's like these people just stop, they give up trying, they have a failure to alter their tactics based on obstacles that they come into contact with. Is it they just lose their will? Is it that the enemy forces are just too strong, or is it they're just overpowered? Or, I mean, is there a common...
Oh, no, there's no one story. So it's almost like looking at the Bible. I mean, all the stories are in there. I mean, you're looking at humanity doing these things, so sometimes people are personally weak. Sometimes there's a big, right? So it's a big, dramatic, it's an epic, right? But there's no one. There's no one. I think the big obstacle for my generation, once we did race, they tried to knock that barrier, was class. I think the world is looking at that now. I think all around the world, people are trying to figure out, okay, how do we move these economic obstacles to freedom out of the way? I think everyone's having that discussion now because of the nature of the crisis we're in, and I think that's what's so important about the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that it's an opportunity to have that. I think everybody needs to be having that discussion in every church, every classroom, every living room, every barbershop, while we can still have a democratic discussion about it, because if this gets much worse, like Greece or some of the other countries, there's going to be a lot of violence, and it'll be hard to have a discussion about it. I think now we can have a visionary discussion about what a democratic society might look like, right? I think once the violence starts, it's very difficult to have the same kind of wholesome discussions. So I'm urging people to have that, to join the Occupy movement and have these discussions. At least you might not be in a demonstration, but at least be part of that discussion, because this is the discussion of our age, I think, right now, right?
It's been interesting sort of following what's going on in Montreal with the rioting, and I live in Vermont, so I have some friends whose kids are in school at McGill, and a lot of the U.S. kids aren't participating in the riots, but Canadians are. And I think that's very reflective of what's going on in this country, with very similar issues around cost of going to college and what's happening with student loans and the interest going up. And I don't see a lot of rebelling. I just see a lot of repression and acceptance.
Well, at Temple, I know about that struggle. They're having demonstrations, but also, even more importantly, discussions about what we have to have conversations about what is the alternative, right? We need those. So I would say people putting down the Occupy movement for just talking. These conversations are absolutely necessary. We need to have discussions about. We've got to figure out, what do we want as an American people? What are our values? And whatever somebody did in China or Spain might not fit America, right? I mean, what do we want? And as an organizer, it's important for me to know what people want, because that's what they'll fight for. You can come up with the dream team, anything you want, but when I know I'm going to when I used to do housing in Newark, I'd be arrested on my way to City Hall. This Komozi Woodard here, they take me and hold me until the meeting was over. They couldn't stop us because my tenants. I was their representative. They went in the meeting and spoke for themselves. You can't stop people when they know what they want, right?
What do you think made the difference, just say, in Montreal, very civilized, educated city, where all of a sudden things have come to a screaming halt? What made the critical mass get to where it was, that people joined that movement and took action?
Well, when I went to Canada, they were on the move back then. That was in the 70s. They were much more, they were taking over. Remember when I was in one thing that hit me when I was in Montreal in 77, I think it was 78, I was in a meeting. My French is very bad. So we were about 5, my son was there, and we had a translator, and there was a mass meeting of students who were helping mothers to stop them from closing down daycare centers. So they were occupying the daycare centers so that the government wouldn't close them down. So this was a meeting of several hundred people. So the guy on stage speaking in French was impassioned. But the woman who was translating for the 5 of us was even more impassioned. And I said, this is a real movement here, right? This is the translator back in the corner. I said, they're going to win because they believe this, right? So I think they've had a very rich history. My only contact, my buddies are in Toronto. Yeah, so they've been organizing. It's just a very different struggle here. That's all I would say about that. But the whole world is thinking about these. And our news access, you almost have to travel to really know what's going on in these other countries, because when they're telling you nothing's going, even in this country, when they're telling you nothing's going on, if you travel around, you start to realize there's a lot going on. Matter of fact, that's why King and Malcolm were so wise, in a sense, because they were traveling from city to city and catching what wasn't in the newspapers. So, you know, they do a travel, and each time they come back and speak in New York, they were wiser because they saw all that was going on in the Midwest and the West that's not in the newspapers, right? And I think now that we have this mass communication, there's a lot out there as far as, we need, one thing that helped us understand things better, we had movement newspapers in the 60s that helped us make sense out of what was going on the West Coast. There's something, and when I was a kid, by reading those papers every week, I said, oh, I'm part of a movement. Because otherwise, I was doing demonstrations against the Board of Education in Newark. But when I realized people in Oakland were doing it too, I said, oh, I'm part of something bigger than my neighborhood. And I think it's hard to get that sense of it without those vehicles. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the things that separates Occupy Wall Street from a lot of stuff that went before is that I think one of the ways that movements didn't necessarily stop, but they sort of continued on, was that people who were at risk or found challenges sort of showed their venom to other groups who were less fortunate. Like that happens a lot.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so I think one of the things that sort of separates what's going on now is that it really is, it goes beyond race, it goes beyond ethnicity, it goes beyond nationality, it goes beyond religion, and so it's kind of a collective. And so, you know, it's not a sense of, well, we got a little bit higher by making you a little bit lower. You know,
Yes.
it's a sense of we're all there.
The reason we tried to make the left forum available to the Occupy movement, and we brought people from the Middle East who've been doing the early demonstrations, and from Europe, is similar to what Ella Baker did with the student sit movement. She thought they needed to come together in one space and talk to each other. And so, even though we had the intergenerational discussion, which was what a lot of the people wanted, we also thought that interregional discussion for those students to be able to be in the same space for a week and talk to each other. And so we don't know what's going to come out of that, but I think part of the job of organizers is to facilitate these conversations, right? I mean, I know when we were in that, we had the Gary Convention, which was the largest Black political convention in American history. And much of the history is about what happened on the platform. But the most important discussions happen in the hotel rooms when people realize, oh, I'm struggling with police brutality in New York. You're doing it in Los Angeles. This is a national problem. You know, it kind of radicalized them to realize, okay, this is not, I thought it was my fault that my son got shot. But no, if kids are getting shot in every city, this is a social issue, right? So that meeting with each other and stuff like that may not be epic-making in the newspapers, that conversation is essential to how movements are built. And also how people identify that your problem is my problem, right? And when we brought the women from the Katrina catastrophe up to Sarah Lawrence, some of those women had never been out of New Orleans before. And we filmed some of the discussions, and the women up here said, you know, I'm your sister. And if you feel depressed, you have a place to come. These things are what makes the movement tick. So I mean, I think the big stuff is important, but I think the little things that are going on when people learn to care about each other and identify that your problem is my problem, this is the stuff that makes movements last longer. So I have a lot of confidence in the next generation. I think we should give them more the help that they need. And I think, you know, offer what kind of resources that we have, but not try to boss them around, because they're going to reject us just like we rejected our parents. I mean, that's the duty of every generation.
To get there, I had to change in the Atlanta airport, and so they have a display of a lot of stuff from Martin Luther King, and they have the transistor you listen to. They're like, this is how he kept in contact, you know, and it's like so old. It's like from my father's era. There I am listening to my iPod, and it's like, this is the old transistor, you know, it's one of those needles that Martin Luther King used to keep in contact, like you're saying. Wow.
Yeah, I had to be, I was on the road with some of these speakers, and it occurred to me that you learn a lot on the road. And that matter of fact, they have this called road speech. And you give it in each city you're in, but you change it every city you're in, because you learn from that something happened in Detroit, you add and add. By the time you get back to the East Coast, it's a different speech, right? Because you're learning that I should compare this case with this housing case that they have here, and so on and so forth. So, anyway, that's the stuff we've been working on. But particularly, I think this is a great book here, just the title, Richard Wright, From Black Boy to World Citizen. In many ways, I think that's the journey that many of us are on. In these movements, from going from our little hamlet that we're from to getting a consciousness of your citizenship in the world, right? And that you have certain human rights you're entitled to, which is an important thing for people to learn what they're entitled to. So anyway, but that's the spiel there, and I hope that anybody else have any comments or things you wanted to add? Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because you were just talking about how your speech changed by going across the country and moving back. Did it change from this morning to this afternoon?
Well,
You got more people this morning?
no less. I always get bored with saying the same thing, so I always change it.
That could be hard.
Yeah, I was taught to have these canned lectures and how easy my life would be, but when I look at a lecture I gave yesterday, I know more now, right? And so, as a matter of fact, I learned some things from the discussion this morning. So. Well, enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Komozi. Thank you very much.